Excellent. Thank you, Eileen. Good afternoon, everyone. So wonderful to see all these faces and names joining us here today. So I'll kick us off. We have several of us who will be on the agenda today sharing out some information. Welcome. We really appreciate your interest in this topic and your time here today on what seems like a very busy week. I'm Juliet Schindler. I serve as Director of Public Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at the College Success Foundation. And my co-presenters today will introduce themselves a little later in the agenda. And as you can see, this briefing is hosted by Project Education Impact, also known as PEI. Those of us representing our organizations on PEI Coalition do so driven by the urgency of the need to focus on the high needs of students furthest from educational justice, students experiencing homelessness, and students in or formerly in foster care. So more on that. First, a bit of housekeeping. In today's session, we will be sharing with you some background about this work group, our 2022 legislative priorities, and findings from our recent legislative report to the legislature. And this report is what informed our legislative agenda. If you do have questions along the way, we want to hear them. Please add them to the chat. We're saving time at the end of our presentation. And if we do run out of time, we will follow up with you directly. So keep those questions coming. And we, again, recognize this is a very busy day. So not everyone who is interested in attending could be here at the event. So we're also recording and then those who are not available to join or for further future viewing will have the recording available. Okay, so we want to start by sharing a bit of information about the need for this work group, Project Education Impact. Students in foster care and students experiencing homelessness face many of the same educational conditions. They have experienced a lot of uncertainty in their life, trauma, and instability. They have changed living situations in schools, often many times. They live with the daily stress of whether they're going to see their mom this week or where they're going to sleep tonight. As a result, these highly mobile students experience similar educational outcomes and perform worse on nearly every educational outcome than every other student group. We see that when they start out behind, for example, in their kindergarten readiness, that just continues on. They graduate at a lower rate than their peers, 60% grad rate for students experiencing homelessness, 51% for students experiencing foster care. That's 2019 numbers. And they are less likely to enroll in a post-secondary institution. These students are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and youth of color. And when these youth do not graduate from high school, they are much more likely to experience poverty, behavioral health issues, homelessness, and incarceration as adults. So hopefully you're interested in learning more about this data, and we invite you to do so by diving into our legislative report. So about PEI, PEI was formed in 2017 to pursue meaningful changes that center and support the unique experiences of these students. We are a legislatively appointed cross-systems work group comprised of legislators, state agencies, members of state committee, and nonprofit organizations. And you can see that list here on the screen of our current membership. We members of PEI possess a fierce and abiding optimism that each and every young person can thrive in school and in life. They deserve strong, coordinated, and youth-centered systems of care that supports their educational journey and mitigates barriers across the state. We also recognize that these two populations, despite facing very similar obstacles, are not identical, and a singular approach will not adequately address the different root causes and experiences of each population. Our goal, our shared goal, is to achieve educational parity for children and youth experiencing foster care and homelessness with the general population student peers from pre-K through post-secondary education, and to close the disparities between racial and ethnic groups by 2027. This goal is also aligned with OSPI's commitment that every student subgroup graduate from high school by 2027. Our last report from January 2019 included 3 major recommendations for how to ensure these students' academic success. First, make ample investments in services and supports. Secondly, align and coordinate resources across systems. And third, leverage data to inform both real-time individualized supports as well as longitudinal analysis of education outcomes. While we've achieved several policy, practice, and legislative changes since 2019, there's still much work to do to achieve education parity for these students by 2027. We are pleased to share this update and this call to action with you all today. And now I'm going to turn it over to a fellow member of PEI, Liza, who will share about our 2022 legislative asks.
Thank you, Juliet. Hi, I'm Liza Burrell, the Program Director at Building Changes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to share the legislative agenda for the Project Education Impact. Many of the report's recommendations call for additional funding and increased capacity and collaboration among the housing, child welfare, early childhood, K-12 education, and post-secondary systems. We asked the legislature to prioritize the following 4 items in the upcoming session. There's a lot more detailed information that we'll send out after this call, so I'm just doing a summary of them. So the first one is to address the growing needs of students experiencing homelessness through the Homeless Student Stability Program, which was created by the Washington State Legislature in 2016 to improve educational outcomes for students experiencing homelessness by providing housing supports through awarding grants to school districts and nonprofits. Those grants are awarded through the Department of Commerce's Office of Homeless Youth, as well as the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. As part of our legislative agenda and ask, we're asking for funding to increase staff capacity for the Office of Homeless Youth, provide needed trainings and technical assistance across system partners and providers, and to collect data to better understand how the education and housing data systems can better align to serve and support students. Our second legislative item on our agenda is to ensure uniform practice and consistent capacity to address the educational stability of students in foster care. Many of our systems face capacity constraints that make it difficult to effectively coordinate to support students. And to ensure uniform practice and increase this capacity, we're asking for 6 additional staff in DCYF's Adolescent Services Division, as well as an additional foster care program supervisor at OSPI. These positions are critical to providing technical assistance and training and data support to social workers and school district staff across our state. Our third item on our agenda is to align and strengthen the laws to ensure all students experiencing foster care have legal access to programs and services. There will be a bill forthcoming this session. This bill will include that will support Washington State's education. Washington State has several laws to support education of students in foster care. However, we have varying definitions that create barriers and confusion that often exclude groups of students. The bill that will be forthcoming will address that. We need to align terminology across education statutes to ensure all students experiencing foster care have the same access to supports. And in addition, we need to increase accountability for these students. So we're requesting the addition of a representative with education expertise to join the DCYF Oversight Board. And our last item on our legislative agenda is to extend and expand funding for mental and behavioral health supports for early childhood programs. We're asking for maintained funding for the Infant and Childhood Mental Health Consultation Program, which contracts with third-party mental health providers to provide behavioral health services in early learning programs. And with that, I will hand off to Sarah to share more about the legislative report.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Brady. I'm here on behalf of Child Care Resources, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager. And I wanted to share with you, I'm here to share about our legislative report, our 2021 report. In 2020, SHB 2711 was passed, and this continued our work group. It added legislators and members from the EOGOAC and requires an annual legislative report on progress and to make recommendations for how to achieve educational equity for these students. So this past spring, in order to center the voices and experiences of those most impacted, we consulted with young people who had experienced foster care or homelessness, and the adults in their orbit included parents, guardians, caregivers, caseworkers, school staff, providers, and advocates. Over several months, PEI members conducted a series of surveys, one-on-one interviews, focus groups, and large discussion groups. And although the COVID-19 pandemic was impacting all Washington young people, we knew in practice that our students were facing additional barriers. Through these engagements with young people, we sought to understand things like how the pandemic was impacting attendance and engagement in school, how schools and childcare supported students and families during the pandemic, if folks felt like they had the information they needed about available programs and resources, and for our students, we also wanted to know how the pandemic changed how they thought about the future and the ways schools had improved or gotten worse for them. While we heard consistent themes, we also recognized that individual students have unique needs. For instance, remote instruction. There's a lot of learning loss and expected data to show that this disproportionately impacted students experiencing homelessness or foster care. And for some students, it increased access and continuity so they could continue their education in their schools of origin, even when their living situations changed. Students had different experiences based on so many factors, things like reliable access to devices and internet, if they're in rural versus urban settings, their age and grade level, the number of kids in their home, if they needed special education supports, or if they are English language learners. This is a complex picture, and we have a lot more engagement and learning to do. Eileen, can I hand it over to you?
Hello, I'm Eileen Graham with Treehouse. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to share, as Sarah mentioned, it is a very complex picture, but want to share a snapshot of some of the themes that we heard and the things that we want to continue to learn about. So in speaking with students and the parents and the caregivers and all the folks that are engaged in their education, we heard a lot that frequent school transitions can impact their outcomes. When students face housing or foster care placement changes, or school stability laws are not adequately implemented, we see things like poor attendance, higher rates of discipline, and just worse education outcomes overall, all the way from kindergarten readiness through high school graduation and post-secondary. We also see that there's a lack of coordination across child welfare, housing, and education systems, and this negatively impacts the ability of the network of adults to effectively support students. So a couple examples of this that we heard across all of these different engagement tactics. Each system has their own language that they use, which makes it complicated to communicate with one another. There's also differently resourced programs, and so it can be hard to know who to go to for support or for a student or a family to know what they're eligible for. Another example was there's disconnecting communication from OSPI to childcare providers that provide service outside of school districts. And we know that those providers were essential in providing remote learning options for our earliest learners, especially during the pandemic. There's also limited access to transportation for early learning providers, such as through ECAP. And so when these things arise, then our students are not getting the supports and the coordination that they need. Another big theme was a lack of capacity within systems. So for instance, the state agencies have a lot of staff assigned to support these students, as well as within school districts themselves, and they often wear many hats, which leads them to feel overextended or to not have the time and resources to do their jobs. So for instance, the education leads at DCYF or the foster care liaisons and McKinney-Vento liaisons in school districts often oversee multiple programs, and they don't have the time or the capacity to meet the specific needs of students experiencing homelessness or foster care. Our surveys also revealed that many adults didn't feel like they had current information about the services that are available or students' rights when it comes to their education. And we also need to recognize that those working with these students need more education and support in delivering culturally attuned, student-centered services, especially for our BIPOC youth, tribal youth, youth who identify as LGBTQIA, and unaccompanied refugee minors. We also heard a very strong need for more expertise in trauma-informed care for our educators. And finally, the final theme was just the impacts of COVID. Children, youth, and all of the adults in their orbit told us particularly that their mental health suffered more than ever due to the social isolation and stress of the pandemic. So out of all of these themes and all of the individual stories and experiences we heard, that really informed the legislative asks that we're pursuing in 2022. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the next steps from what we heard from this engagement.
Thank you, Eileen. Yeah, looking forward, based on the feedback and the updated data we received, the October legislative report made a series of recommendations to various groups that we need to work together to achieve our common goal. And so our recommendations are divided in 3 categories. We have recommendations to the legislature, recommendations to specific state agencies, and recommendations that we've assigned to ourselves as PEI. These recommendations are designed to work together to address barriers and move forward towards educational equity for young people experiencing homelessness or in foster care. And we believe they cannot be implemented in silos. Because we have limited time today, we encourage you to review our recommendations. They're on page 9 and through 11 of the PEI legislative report. But one takeaway we want to make sure you hear is that in our state, we have built and funded educational services and supports for students in foster care in K through 12 through contracts with community-based organizations. And while students experiencing homelessness have similar outcomes, there are not equivalent services or supports for them. 40,000 students in our K-12 system are experiencing homelessness, and districts are not equipped or funded to provide these services. So there's a need for collaboration between districts and housing providers, as well as educational support services like educational advocacy for students experiencing homelessness. And to that end, legislators should expect that we will bring a major request forth in the 2021-23 biennium to address the needs of students experiencing homelessness. Over the next year, PEI will be seeking to continue to understand the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic for our populations. We're also seeking to identify best practices around ensuring school stability, transportation, attendance, and appropriate discipline. And we want to determine whether PEI should expand its focus to include students in institutional settings like juvenile detention or rehabilitation facilities. We want to evaluate existing programs and best practices for students in post-secondary programs. And we want to identify policies and practices to support educational outcomes for students in kinship care, including kinship situations, informal kinship situations. I'll hand it over now to Shana and Peggy for our Q&A session.
Thank you, Sarah. I just put the link in the chat to the legislative report. Hopefully that worked. Let me know if it didn't come through, but we wanted to make sure we had a lot of time for questions. Many of the PEI members are here with us today on the call. And so if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you can raise your little hand, your Zoom hand, and we'd be happy to try and get an answer. And I didn't introduce myself. My name's Peggy Carlson. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction as the foster care program supervisor, which means I support the school districts around implementing federal and state law. And Shanna, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shanna McBride, and I'm the DCYF counterpart to Peggy. I'm the Education Program Manager for Kids in Foster Care for our agency.
And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I know you all have the legislative report now, and it's big, and you might want to dig through. Oh, we're not seeing that in the chat box. Eileen, can you try and stick that in the chat box? Oh, it worked for some people. I'll try it again.
Too, and we'll be sure to email it out to you afterwards as well.
Okay, yeah, we'll email it out to everyone. If you have questions as you go through that report, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We are happy to answer your questions or get you to the right people to answer your questions. And I do want to make a quick comment that working in this group, in the Project Education Impact Group, has been very impactful for me to be with all of these state agencies and legislators and nonprofits. And we all have the same goal, and that's to improve life for our students who are experiencing homelessness and our students in foster care. And we've done so much work, and we're looking forward to doing more work, and it's just exciting, and we really want to make a difference for these kids. We really want to improve their access to education and help them be successful. I don't see any raised hands. Okay, there's a question in the chat that says, have you considered reaching out to the counseling department at OSPI about the 50/30 project funding to see if there's any support for these students specifically? And that's a great question. And that's something we will pursue. Since I work at OSPI, it's easy for me to collaborate. We haven't done that so far, but I work with the counseling people at OSPI on a regular basis. We have a good relationship, so I will definitely bring that up with them. Thank you for the suggestion, Carrie. Okay, well, I'm going to give you all some time back in your day. We really, really appreciate you joining us. And like I said, if you have questions related to the report, you can reach out and we will get an answer to you. Thank you for spending this portion of your day with us. And I hope everyone gets a chance to relax and enjoy and celebrate whatever holiday you celebrate in the coming weeks, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.